It was just another Tuesday morning in the quiet town of Brooksville, a place where most people knew each other by name. The sun had risen in the same calm manner it always did, spilling soft golden light over the familiar streets and homes. Life moved at a slow and predictable pace here. This day, however, was about to change everything. Jason Carter, a 38-year-old software developer, was no stranger to the routine of his life. A quiet man who had never sought out the spotlight, he preferred the comfort of routine. His morning coffee from the local cafe, the steady hum of his laptop as he worked, and the evening spent unwinding with a good book or an episode of his favorite crime drama. But today, Jason found himself packing for a business trip to Chicago, an event that should have been just another ordinary task on his calendar. He wasn't thrilled about the flight, but he learned long ago that the world outside his comfortable bubble sometimes demanded a little sacrifice. As he pulled his suitcase through the front door, his mind wandered to the list of meetings awaiting him on the other side of the country. He wasn't particularly excited about them, but the job was steady, and it provided him with just enough stability to live comfortably. Jason had never been one to crave drama or excitement. He liked things quiet, predictable, and safe. But today, as he locked the door behind him and got into his car, he unknowingly set the course for a life-altering experience. The local airport was nothing special, a small regional terminal with 2 gates, some fast food joints, and a handful of travelers. Jason had been through it hundreds of times. He didn't expect anything unusual, and he certainly didn't expect to see the woman who would disrupt his day and force him into the middle of a controversy that would ripple through the community. Her name was Karen, a woman whose presence alone seemed to command attention, even before she opened her mouth. At first glance, she appeared like any other traveler. In her mid-40s, well-dressed in a pair of designer sunglasses and a flowing blouse, Karen was the type of person who exuded an air of importance, as if her very existence deserved acknowledgement. But it wasn't long before Jason noticed her actions. She was already causing a stir, loudly complaining about something at the check-in counter, her voice rising over the hum of the terminal. She wasn't being rude, at least not yet, but it was clear she was frustrated about something. Jason glanced over briefly as he stood in line, his curiosity piqued by her theatrics, but he didn't think much of it. After all, airports brought out the worst in people, especially when things didn't go as planned. It wasn't until he boarded the plane that the real trouble began. Jason had hoped for a peaceful flight, an opportunity to catch up on some work, and perhaps squeeze in a little rest before the whirlwind of meetings. But as soon as he stepped into the plane, he saw Karen again. She was sitting in her seat, fidgeting with her bag, casting annoyed glances at the flight attendants who passed by. Jason made his way to his own seat, trying to mind his own business, but it wasn't long before Karen's complaints began to fill the cabin. First, she was upset about the seating arrangements. The flight attendant had made a mistake, or so she claimed, and Karen wasn't pleased with the explanation. Then, a young mother in the row ahead had a baby that was crying softly. The noise was entirely normal for a plane, but Karen seemed unable, or unwilling, to tolerate it. Her voice rose, demanding that something be done about the baby's cries. Her frustration was palpable, and she made sure that everyone within earshot knew how deeply inconvenienced she felt. Jason, who was sitting across the aisle, tried to block out the noise, but it was impossible to ignore her. It seemed as though Karen was determined to make everyone aware of her displeasure. As the plane took off, the tension in the cabin mounted. The baby's cries grew louder, which only seemed to fuel Karen's anger. She turned around in her seat, shooting daggers at the mother and the child. Jason could feel the energy in the air, thick with discomfort. The flight attendants, trying their best to keep the peace, walked down the aisle with reassuring smiles, but Karen wasn't having it. She was on the warpath now, and nothing would stop her. Jason couldn't help but glance over at her once more, his own unease growing. What was it about this woman that made her so intolerant? Was it her sense of entitlement? Her inability to see beyond her own immediate discomfort? The flight attendants tried to defuse the situation, but Karen wasn't having it. She snapped at them, accusing them of poor service, and even threatening to report them for mishandling her seating issue. Jason watched as one of the flight attendants calmly explained the airline's policy and tried to redirect Karen's attention. But nothing worked. The more the flight attendants tried to soothe her, the angrier Karen became. It was as if her world had fallen apart because she wasn't getting exactly what she wanted. Her sense of entitlement was on full display for all to see. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing. Should he intervene? Should he say something? He had always prided himself on being a calm, non-confrontational person, but the atmosphere in the cabin was quickly becoming unbearable. Other passengers were starting to murmur, some glancing over at Karen with expressions of disbelief. The situation was escalating, and Jason felt the tension in the air. He tried to focus on his laptop, but his eyes kept flickering back to Karen and the mother with the crying baby. His stomach churned as the drama unfolded in front of him. Would things settle down, or was this just the beginning of something much bigger? At that moment, Jason had no idea that the events set in motion by this woman, Karen, would change not only the course of his day, but also his life. As the plane continued its journey, an uneasy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the occasional sob of the baby and Karen's loud complaints. The stage was set, and what happened next would shock everyone on board, including Jason, who had no idea he was about to be caught in the middle of a storm that would make headlines. This was no longer just an ordinary day. The calm of Brooksville and Jason's quiet existence was about to be shattered. The plane soared above the clouds, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to the rising tension within the cabin. Jason couldn't concentrate on his work anymore. Every few seconds, his gaze flicked over to Karen, whose complaints had escalated to a full-blown tirade. Her voice, shrill and demanding, cut through the otherwise mundane sounds of the flight, and her actions were beginning to draw the attention of everyone around her. People who had been quietly reading or looking out the windows were now looking nervously at one another, whispering in hushed tones. Jason could feel it too. Something was about to snap. The baby's cries were still there, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to fuel Karen's growing fury. She had already made a scene when she first boarded, loudly demanding that the child be quieted, as though the mother of the infant had any control over the situation. But now, the baby's crying had become a convenient scapegoat for all of Karen's frustrations. With each passing minute, Karen's anger swelled, her sharp words becoming more pointed, more hurtful. She wasn't just complaining anymore. She was attacking the other passengers. Jason could hear her muttering under her breath, calling the mother irresponsible, and even accusing the flight attendants of doing nothing to stop it. There was a touch of entitlement in her tone, the kind that suggested she believed the world should bend to her will. "Can you please do something about this?" Karen snapped, turning around to face the flight attendants, her voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "I'm paying for this flight, and I expect some peace and quiet. Is that too much to ask for?" Her words were sharp, her eyes hard, as though the flight attendants were somehow personally responsible for the crying baby. One of the attendants, a young woman named Sarah, approached Karen with an air of professionalism that seemed out of place given the increasingly volatile situation. "We understand your frustration, ma'am," Sarah said calmly, her hands folded in front of her. "But we're doing everything we can to ensure the comfort of all passengers. Please try to be patient." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she scoffed loudly, causing several other passengers to look over in discomfort. "Patience," she hissed, leaning forward in her seat, her face inches from Sarah. "You call this patience? You're doing nothing. I've been on flights before where the staff actually cared about the passengers. This is ridiculous." Jason could feel the heat of Karen's anger radiating across the aisle, her voice now a constant buzz in the background. It was almost like a low electric hum, a noise that slowly gnawed away at the calm of the flight. He had been on flights where people got upset over small things, but this was different. This wasn't just an inconvenience for Karen. It was an insult. And she wasn't going to let it slide. The tension built with every passing minute. The baby's cries persisted, but they were no louder than any infants could be on a flight. The mother, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and a frazzled look, tried her best to comfort her child, but it was clear that nothing was going to appease Karen. Every cry was an attack in Karen's eyes, every whimper a personal affront. The other passengers had begun to look uneasy, some shifting in their seats, others trying to distract themselves by pretending to read or fumble with their phones. But there was no escaping the growing storm in the air. Jason tried to tune it out, but it was impossible. The flight attendants continued to make polite efforts to de-escalate the situation, but it was clear that Karen wasn't interested in being reasoned with. Every time the attendants walked past, she would shoot them a look of contempt, her lips curling into a sneer. The other passengers, meanwhile, looked on with a mixture of sympathy for the mother and irritation at Karen's refusal to let go of her tantrum. And then it happened. The situation hit its boiling point when Karen, unable to contain herself any longer, shot to her feet. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, causing everyone to look up. With a voice that could only be described as theatrical, she pointed a finger at the flight attendants and demanded, "I want to speak to the captain. This is outrageous. I demand to speak to the captain right now. This is unacceptable." Her words echoed down the aisle, and a hushed silence fell over the cabin. Jason's heart raced, and he could sense that everyone on the plane was holding their breath. The flight attendants exchanged a glance before Sarah spoke again, her voice more firm now. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said, her tone still polite but clearly edged with a warning. "We can't disturb the captain while a flight is in progress. You need to calm down." Karen's face turned crimson with rage, her eyes wild as she threw her hands up in exasperation. "I don't care what you say. I'm not sitting down until someone takes action. This is the worst flight I've ever been on. I am entitled to a peaceful journey, and you're all doing nothing." It was a shocking outburst, the kind of behavior no one expected on a routine flight. The passengers' discomfort grew palpable as they exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. Jason could feel the weight of the moment. He had witnessed public outbursts before, but this was different. This wasn't just a woman upset over a minor inconvenience. This was a battle for control. The sense of entitlement in Karen's voice, the way she demanded things bend to her will, it was like she believed the entire flight was there to cater to her. The calm, orderly world of air travel had been disrupted, and Jason couldn't look away. Sarah, ever the professional, stepped back for a moment, trying to assess the situation. "Ma'am, please calm down," she repeated, her voice steady, but now carrying a note of urgency. "If you don't return to your seat, we'll have to ask you to leave the plane. We can't allow disruptive behavior." The words were final, and they hung in the air like a ticking clock. Karen looked like she was about to erupt, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her chest heaving with every breath. Jason could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the tension that had been building for so long now at its peak. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Karen back down, or was the situation about to spiral out of control? As the minutes ticked by, it became clear that Karen wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to be placated or ignored. The situation was now completely out of control. Jason's hands tightened around his armrests as he braced for what would come next. He had no idea that, in just a few moments, the flight would take an unexpected turn, one that would forever change the course of this ordinary journey. The tension in the cabin was palpable. The other passengers, once quietly absorbed in their own worlds, were now riveted by the drama unfolding before them. Some had even pulled out their phones, discreetly capturing the spectacle, while others exchanged murmured whispers, wondering just how far this could go. Jason's eyes were fixed on Karen as she stood, her fists clenched at her sides, her body trembling with barely contained rage. She was a powder keg ready to explode. and everyone on board was waiting for the spark. The flight attendants, trying their best to maintain control, had exchanged a few hushed words, but it was clear that the situation was spiraling beyond their capacity to manage. "Ma'am, please sit down," Sarah said again, her voice now tinged with a firmness that hadn't been there before. "We can't continue the flight if you don't comply. If you continue this behavior, we'll have to involve security." Jason could see the shift in Karen's face as those words hit her. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she assessed her options. She had clearly expected a different outcome. The thought of being forced off the plane, of having to leave, was the one thing that had the power to pierce through her outrage. She was the kind of person who expected to get her way, no matter the cost, but even she understood the implications of being kicked off a flight. It was a rare and serious consequence, something that could cost her time, money, and possibly her reputation. But the reality of the situation didn't seem to faze her. Instead of backing down, Karen's expression twisted into something even darker, almost as if she was daring the crew to follow through on their threat. "You don't understand," she spat, the venom in her words cutting through the air. "I will have all of you fired for this. I know my rights. You can't just treat me like this." The words were laced with arrogance, with the confidence of someone who believed they were above the rules, above the law. Karen's sense of entitlement was so strong that it seemed to fill the entire cabin, suffocating the other passengers. But it wasn't just the other passengers who were feeling the heat of her anger. Jason, too, felt a strange, uncomfortable mix of sympathy and disbelief. He had never encountered someone like Karen before. He'd seen people complain, yes, but nothing like this. Nothing so unrelenting, so vicious. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the cabin grew. The flight attendants, looking more than a little overwhelmed, began to signal to the cockpit. Jason could only imagine the radio call that was being made at that very moment. The request for security to meet the plane upon arrival. The announcement that someone would be removed from the flight. But as that reality began to sink in, something unexpected happened. Karen, who had been standing just moments before, suddenly collapsed back into her seat with a dramatic, almost theatrical sigh. She threw her hands up in defeat, her eyes scanning the cabin with a mixture of defiance and defeat. "Fine," she muttered bitterly, her voice low but still carrying an edge. "If you want to kick me off the plane, go ahead. But you'll regret this." Jason watched, stunned, as the entire scene seemed to shift in an instant. The once heated confrontation appeared to be diffusing, but only because Karen was now waiting for the inevitable moment when she would be escorted off the plane. She was playing her part, going through the motions of giving up only to preserve some shred of dignity. And in that moment it became clear to Jason that Karen didn't care about the baby or the flight attendants or even the other passengers. She cared only about her own image, about ensuring that she had the last word, no matter how absurd it seemed. But things weren't over yet. The pilot, after being briefed by the flight crew, had made a decision. The plane was going to land early. There was no way they could continue the flight with the situation as it was. They couldn't afford to allow a disruptive passenger to escalate the situation any further, especially with the safety of everyone on board at stake. The cabin crew had tried their best to handle the situation, but Karen's behavior had gone too far. Jason could hear the faint hum of the plane's radio system as the captain made the call to change course. They would be landing at a nearby airport, just an hour away from their original destination. The announcement came over the intercom, and for a split second, Jason thought the world had stopped. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice rang out, calm but firm. "We have encountered a situation that requires us to make an unscheduled stop. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." It was a simple statement, but it carried a weight that made every passenger sit up straighter, their attention fully focused on the situation. Jason's heart rate quickened. This was no longer just a flight. This was a spectacle in the making. As the plane changed course, Jason watched as Karen finally accepted the inevitable. She still muttered under her breath, her words laced with bitterness and resentment, but she no longer had the same fiery energy. The threat of being removed from the plane had taken the wind out of her sails. She was no longer the dominant force in the situation. Now she was simply a passenger, like everyone else, waiting for the plane to land. But there was a strange sense of calm in the air now, a quiet tension that had replaced the earlier anger. It was as if everyone on board understood that something larger was at play, that this event was about to ripple out beyond the confines of this small plane and into the outside world. The landing was smooth, almost eerily so, and as the plane touched down, Jason's mind raced. He had been a passive observer up until this point, unsure of whether to get involved or not. But now, as the plane taxied to its gate and security personnel appeared on the tarmac, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another flight. Something significant had happened here, something that would echo beyond this one flight. The door opened, and Karen, looking defeated but still defiant, was escorted off the plane by two security officers. Jason watched her go, her head held high despite the situation, as if she could still salvage some dignity from the experience. But Jason knew the truth. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. As the plane continued on its journey, Jason couldn't help but reflect on the strange chain of events that had led to this moment. He had come aboard expecting a simple, uneventful flight. Instead, he had witnessed an explosive confrontation that would change everything. What had begun as a petty complaint about a crying baby had spiraled into a spectacle of entitlement, arrogance, and public humiliation. And in the quiet aftermath, Jason realized something. There were far more consequences to this event than anyone could possibly imagine. It was just the beginning of a story that would capture the attention of an entire community. The plane continued its journey after the unscheduled landing, but the atmosphere had shifted. What was once a routine flight had now become the focal point of an unfolding drama that would extend far beyond the confines of the aircraft. The remaining passengers, many of whom had witnessed the chaotic scene with Karen, were left in a collective state of shock and discomfort. Jason, who had initially tried to remain a neutral observer, found himself increasingly drawn into the aftermath of the incident. As the plane touched down at the nearby airport, he realized that this wasn't just another travel inconvenience. It had become a pivotal moment for everyone involved. As soon as the flight landed and the plane had come to a complete stop, a sense of unease spread across the cabin. Some passengers, like Jason, were glued to their seats, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Others began gathering their belongings, murmuring to one another about what had happened. But amidst the growing buzz, one thing was certain. This incident wasn't over. Karen's departure was just the beginning of the storm. Jason remained seated as the other passengers filed off the plane, still not sure if he should get involved. He had done nothing wrong after all. He was simply a witness to the events, a bystander in a story that had somehow become bigger than all of them. But as the plane doors opened and the crew began ushering people out, Jason's mind raced. He had never been part of something like this before. Sure, he had heard stories about passengers causing disruptions, but this had escalated in a way he hadn't anticipated. The first shock came when Jason, along with the remaining passengers, was escorted through the airport terminal to a holding area while the situation was sorted out. The airport had quickly become ground zero for media coverage, with several news outlets already swarming the area, eager to get a story. It wasn't long before Jason realized the full extent of the situation. Karen, the woman who had set everything in motion, wasn't just some random disgruntled passenger. She had a following, and that following had quickly taken notice of what had happened. When Jason and the other passengers were finally allowed to leave the terminal and head towards the shuttle to continue their journey, he was approached by a reporter. The woman, holding a microphone and a camera in her hands, stopped him as he was about to board the shuttle. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice both professional and insistent. "We're doing a segment on the incident with the woman removed from the flight. Would you be willing to share your perspective on what happened?" Jason froze. He hadn't expected to be thrust into the spotlight like this. He had been an observer, not a participant. But the reporter's eyes were eager, and the camera's lens was trained on him, waiting for him to say something. After a moment's hesitation, Jason found his voice. I was just a passenger," he stammered. "I saw what happened. But I don't know if I can really add anything to the story." The reporter's smile didn't fade. "That's exactly what we need, someone who was there. Just tell us what you saw, what it was like in the cabin. The viewers want to know what led up to her removal. Was she really that disruptive?" Jason felt a strange pull. His mind raced as he considered the implications of speaking out. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, their curiosity just as piqued as his own. He had witnessed the entire escalation, the way Karen had gone from a mildly disgruntled passenger to a full-blown storm of anger and entitlement. But was he really the best person to explain it all? Would his account even matter in the grand scheme of things? Despite his reservations, Jason began speaking. "It started small," he said, his voice quieter now. "She was complaining about the seating arrangement, and then about the baby crying. But it didn't stop there. She got louder, more aggressive. Eventually, she demanded to speak to the captain, and that's when the flight attendants had to step in." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I think what surprised everyone was the way she refused to listen to reason. She wasn't interested in an explanation. She wanted to control the situation, no matter what. And when the flight attendants asked her to calm down, she didn't." The reporter nodded, scribbling down notes. "So it was just her behavior that caused the flight to be diverted." Jason hesitated, his mind now flashing back to the moments before Karen was removed from the plane. Her defiance, her refusal to back down, her sense of entitlement. It had all escalated in a way that Jason couldn't have predicted. "I think the crew did everything they could. But when she threatened to report them and refused to sit down, I guess that's when it crossed the line. It became more than just a disagreement. It became a safety issue." The reporter nodded again, giving him a satisfied smile. "Thank you for your time. You've been very helpful. This is exactly what we needed." As she turned to speak with other passengers, Jason's thoughts swirled. He had been thrust into something he never anticipated. A simple flight turned into a viral story. The media would soon latch onto the narrative, casting him as a key witness in a drama that had already captured the attention of countless people. But what did that mean for him? What would come of this sudden attention? Would his words, his involvement in this incident, change anything? Little did Jason know that the media frenzy surrounding the incident had only just begun. Within hours, the story had gone viral, with news outlets all over the country picking up the details of the flight's dramatic diversion. Online forums and social media platforms were flooded with opinions, debates, and arguments. Some people sided with Karen, expressing outrage over what they saw as an overreaction by the crew. Others condemned her behavior, calling for consequences to be imposed for her entitled attitude. But amidst the noise, one thing was clear. The incident had struck a nerve. People were passionate about it, and they wanted answers. Back in his small town, Jason's phone began ringing nonstop. He had been contacted by reporters from local stations, and even a few from national networks, asking for his account of what had happened. His social media accounts were suddenly flooded with messages, some supportive, others critical. Friends and family reached out, either congratulating him on his newfound fame or questioning why he hadn't spoken up sooner. It felt surreal, like he had somehow become part of a larger narrative that was beyond his control. But as the days went on, Jason began to see the true consequences of that fateful flight. Karen, who had once been just another stranger on a plane, was now a viral sensation, her name being shared and discussed everywhere. She had become a symbol of entitlement and social media outrage, a figurehead for debates about customer service, personal responsibility, and the limits of individual rights. But there was something else that began to weigh on Jason's mind: the community. The small town of Brooksville, once known for its quiet charm, had become a place where everyone knew about the flight, where whispers followed him through the grocery store, and where his every move seemed to be scrutinized. The reality of his involvement in the story hit him hard. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about him too. His quiet life had been disrupted, and the ripple effects were reaching into every corner of his community. How would things change? Would people look at him differently now that he was part of this story? Would the same people who had once ignored him now treat him as a minor celebrity? Jason had no answers. All he knew for sure was that everything had shifted. The incident had transformed the community, and in ways he hadn't yet understood, it had transformed him as well. What had started as a random, uncomfortable encounter on a plane had become something far more complicated, and Jason was at the center of it all. As the days passed after the flight, Jason found himself at a crossroads, struggling to make sense of everything that had unfolded. The media storm that followed Karen's outburst showed no sign of slowing down, and Jason's brief moment in the spotlight began to feel like a weight on his shoulders. The phone calls and messages kept coming, each one pulling him deeper into the chaos of the incident he had barely been involved in. What started as a simple witness to a disruptive passenger had now transformed him into a reluctant participant in a national conversation about entitlement, customer service, and public behavior. At first, Jason had tried to distance himself from the story. He declined most of the interview requests, choosing instead to focus on his daily routine. He didn't want to be known as the witness from that viral flight. He had no interest in becoming a talking point for the media or his community. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more he realized that it was impossible to escape the ripple effects of the incident. People in his town, strangers and friends alike, had their opinions about the story, and Jason was now a part of it, whether he liked it or not. It wasn't just the media attention that began to weigh on him. It was the way people in his community began to treat him. People who had once passed him by without a second glance were now stopping him in the streets, eager to ask about the flight, to hear his side of the story. It wasn't just idle curiosity. It was as if Jason had become a living symbol of the controversy. Some people praised him for keeping his composure in the face of Karen's outbursts, while others chastised him for not intervening sooner. The discussions were everywhere. At the grocery store, in the coffee shop, even during casual conversations with old friends. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what had happened, and they were more than willing to share it. Jason began to feel a deep sense of discomfort, the weight of everyone's expectations settling on him like a cloak he didn't want to wear. He had never asked for this. He had never imagined that a routine flight would turn into a life-altering experience. But now, his involvement in the story was undeniable. The question he kept asking himself was whether he had done the right thing by staying silent, by merely observing the chaos unfold without stepping in. Could he have done more? Should he have intervened, stood up for the baby, or done something to prevent the situation from escalating? As he reflected on those moments, Jason realized that the situation was far more complex than he had initially thought. There were layers to it that weren't immediately obvious in the heat of the moment. There was the fact that Karen had been behaving in a way that was clearly disruptive, but there was also the reality that she had been pushed to her breaking point. Karen wasn't just angry about a crying baby or a seating issue. She was angry about something deeper, something that Jason had failed to see at first. She was a person who felt entitled to get her way at all costs, and in that moment, when things weren't going the way she expected, she had exploded. But the real question that lingered in Jason's mind was, how much responsibility did he have for what happened? Could he have done something, anything, to prevent the chain of events from reaching its breaking point? The more Jason thought about it, the more he began to realize that the entire incident had a deeper significance, one that reached beyond the confines of the plane and the media frenzy. It wasn't just about Karen. It wasn't just about the baby or the flight attendants. It was about the broader issues of entitlement, self-absorption, and the way society treated others in moments of stress. Karen's behavior had been a reflection of something much larger, a cultural shift toward individualism, and a lack of empathy for those around us. In her mind, her needs and desires had been more important than anyone else's, and she had used her power, her privilege, to demand the world bend to her will. Jason's mind began to shift as he realized that his perspective had been too narrow. At first, he had seen Karen as nothing more than a nuisance, a woman whose inability to handle a minor inconvenience had ruined an otherwise normal flight. But now, he could see her as a product of a larger societal issue. She wasn't just a random woman causing chaos on a plane. She was a reflection of the entitlement and arrogance that had become so pervasive in modern society. But even as Jason began to grapple with these broader ideas, the fallout from the incident continued to impact his life. The media attention, the endless opinions, and the constant questioning from his community left him feeling unsettled. People wanted answers, but no one seemed to understand the complexity of the situation. They all had their own opinions about what should have happened, but no one had been in his shoes. No one had been sitting there, quietly observing as Karen's behavior escalated into something uncontrollable. No one had felt the weight of the moment, the pressure to act or not act, as Jason had. The whole situation was beginning to feel like a test of his character, of his ability to navigate the complexities of human behavior and societal expectations. And in the end, Jason realized that there were no easy answers. There was no right or wrong decision in that moment, no simple way to resolve the conflict. In some ways, he had acted in the only way he knew how, by staying out of it, by observing, by hoping that someone else would step in and handle the situation. But as time went on, Jason began to see that his decision to stay silent wasn't necessarily wrong. It was just human. It was a response to a situation that was beyond anyone's control, a response to the chaos that had erupted around him. The more he reflected on it, the more he realized that everyone involved in that incident had made choices, and those choices had shaped the outcome. Karen had chosen to lash out, to demand control in a situation where control was impossible. The flight attendants had chosen to try to calm her down, but their training had limits. Jason had chosen to stay silent, to watch and reflect, but in doing so, he had also learned something important about the human condition. Now, as the days continued to drag on, Jason found himself wrestling with the idea of responsibility. He wondered if there was a larger lesson here, one that extended beyond the confines of his own life. Was this incident a sign of something deeper, a warning that people like Karen were becoming more common? Or was it simply a reminder that the world was filled with unpredictable, chaotic moments, and the only thing we could do was try to navigate them the best we could? The community's reaction to the incident had been equally divided. Some had seen Jason as a hero for remaining calm and collected in the face of Karen's fury. Others had labeled him as complicit, questioning why he hadn't done more to help the mother and child. No matter what he did, no matter what he said, he couldn't escape the fact that he was now part of the story. And as much as he wanted to go back to his quiet life, Jason realized that it was no longer possible. The incident had transformed him, just as it had transformed his community. Everyone had been touched by it in one way or another. And now, they were all left to make sense of it. Jason's journey, like that of everyone else involved, was just beginning. The impact of that flight had rippled through the community, leaving behind questions that would take time to answer. But one thing was certain: it had changed everything. For Jason, for the passengers, for the flight attendants, and for Karen, it was a moment that could never be undone. And now, it was up to each of them to navigate the fallout, to decide what they had learned, and what they would do next. Weeks had passed since the flight, but the echoes of that chaotic day still reverberated through Jason's life. The once quiet town of Brooksville had become a place where the incident was constantly discussed, analyzed, and dissected. It wasn't just a local topic of conversation. It had spread beyond the community, becoming a symbol of broader societal issues. The incident had sparked debates about entitlement, public behavior, and the limits of personal responsibility. But for Jason, it had become a personal journey of reflection and transformation. As time went on, Jason couldn't escape the feeling that his life had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. His quiet, predictable routine had been upended, and in its place, a sense of uncertainty had taken hold. He was no longer just the guy who worked from home, had a few friends, and kept to himself. Now, he was the guy who had been involved in that viral flight incident. The attention was overwhelming, even if it wasn't the kind of attention he'd ever wanted. People looked at him differently now. They saw him as someone who had witnessed a pivotal moment, someone whose perspective could help explain what went wrong that day. It felt strange to be at the center of something that had become so much bigger than he ever imagined. It wasn't just strangers and reporters who were seeking his opinion. His friends and family had started to ask him the same questions over and over again. They wanted to know what he thought about Karen, about the flight attendants, about the other passengers. Did he think Karen deserved to be kicked off the plane? Should the flight attendants have done more? Could he have done something to change the outcome? Jason felt a constant pressure to have answers, to offer clarity where there was none. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what the right answer was. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how complex the situation had been. The tension between personal responsibility and collective action, between individual entitlement and social cooperation. It wasn't something that could be boiled down to a simple conclusion. Jason had tried to move on, tried to return to his normal life. But the impact of the event followed him. It wasn't just the media frenzy or the attention from the community. It was the way he saw the world differently now. He had always been a quiet observer of life, content to stay out of the way and avoid conflict. But now, Jason understood that sometimes the world didn't give you that luxury. Sometimes you were forced to be part of something bigger, something you couldn't control. It was a sobering realization, one that weighed on him more than he cared to admit. He found himself asking questions he'd never considered before. What would have happened if he had spoken up when Karen was causing a scene? Would things have turned out differently if he had stepped in, if he had tried to intervene in some way? And yet, even as he reflected on these questions, Jason couldn't help but feel that there were no easy answers. The event had also forced Jason to confront his own sense of responsibility. It was easy to look at someone like Karen and dismiss her as just another entitled person who needed to be put in their place. But the more he thought about it, the more he saw how her behavior was a reflection of something deeper, something that went beyond the confines of that flight. Karen wasn't just a random passenger who had lost her temper. She was a product of a culture that often placed individual desires and self-importance above the needs of others. It wasn't just about her. She was a symbol of the broader issues facing society. The sense of entitlement, the expectation that the world should cater to your every whim, the refusal to accept that life sometimes doesn't go as planned. It was all a part of a much larger conversation. Jason realized that, in many ways, Karen was a reflection of the world around him. A world that had grown more self-centered, more impatient, more quick to judge and dismiss others. As Jason wrestled with these ideas, he began to notice small changes in the way he interacted with people, the way he listened to others, the way he responded to their concerns. It was all different now. He found himself paying more attention to the small details, the subtle ways in which people communicated their needs and frustrations. It was as though the flight had opened his eyes to the complexities of human behavior, to the ways in which people's actions were often shaped by forces beyond their control. He started to see things in a more nuanced way, no longer viewing events in terms of black and white, but recognizing the shades of gray that made up the human experience. The community, too, was changing in its response to the incident. At first, people had been divided. Some felt that Karen's behavior was completely unjustified, while others sympathized with her frustration. But as the weeks wore on, the community began to reflect on what had happened. Conversations shifted from condemnation to introspection. People started to question their own roles in society, their own sense of entitlement, and how their actions affected those around them. The incident had sparked something in the town, a collective self-awareness that hadn't existed before. People who had never spoken up in the past were now engaging in discussions about empathy, about standing up for others, about creating a more compassionate environment. Jason found himself at the center of these conversations, albeit reluctantly. His perspective, as someone who had witnessed the events unfold, had become valuable in a way he hadn't expected. People began reaching out to him, not just for his account of the flight, but for his thoughts on what had happened afterward. They wanted to know how the incident had changed him, how it had changed their community. Jason realized that his silence, his decision not to intervene in the moment, had become a point of reflection for others. It had forced people to confront their own choices, their own inactions, and to think about how they would respond if faced with a similar situation. In the midst of all this, Jason found a strange sense of peace. He had never been the type of person to seek out attention, to be at the center of drama or controversy. But as he reflected on everything that had transpired, he realized that the incident had forced him to grow in ways he hadn't expected. He had been pushed out of his comfort zone, made to confront the complexities of human behavior, and forced to reckon with his own role in the world around him. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something he would have chosen, but Jason knew that he had learned something important from it. The final twist came when Jason was contacted by a community organization that had been formed in the aftermath of the incident. The group, focused on promoting empathy, understanding, and respectful dialogue in public spaces, invited him to speak at their next meeting. At first, Jason balked at the idea. He wasn't a public speaker, and the thought of sharing his thoughts with a room full of strangers was intimidating. But as he thought about it, he realized that this was an opportunity to make something positive come out of the chaos. Maybe his story, his experiences, could help others see the importance of empathy, of standing up for what's right, of thinking beyond one's own immediate desires. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start using the lessons he had learned to make a difference. Jason agreed to speak, and when the time came, he stood before the crowd, sharing his story of that fateful flight and the lessons he had learned since. He spoke about entitlement, about empathy, about how the smallest actions could ripple out and affect the world in ways we never expected. And as he spoke, he realized that the flight, Karen's outburst, the baby's cries, the flight attendant's calm professionalism, had all been part of something much larger than himself. It was a moment that had changed him, that had changed his community, and that had changed the way he saw the world. As he finished speaking, Jason looked out at the audience, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent for a moment, and then a slow, thoughtful applause began. It wasn't just for him, it was for everyone, for the community that had come together to reflect on the lessons of that day. Jason realized, in that moment, that everything had transformed. The incident that had started as a random, uncomfortable event had become a catalyst for change, for growth, for understanding. And in a world that often felt divided and uncertain, that was something worth celebrating. Jason left the meeting that night with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the most unexpected moments could lead to the most profound transformations. The flight, the chaos, and the decisions that followed had shaped him in ways he hadn't anticipated. And now he was ready to take that experience, that new perspective, and use it to make a difference, starting with himself, and hopefully extending to those around him. The journey had only just begun.